This is my latest track called Goodbye Okjokull, and I'm butchering the name. I think it's supposed to be pronounced
Okjokull,
but to me it really sounds like Okjokull. And I want to use that as an example of how I sort of make music using the sort of the gear I have here, the sort of sequencer, chord progressions, how the sort of various synthesizer patches are layered and triggered and things like that. And talk about the process. So I usually start from chord progression. In this particular case, I believe that we're in G minor because I looked it up after the fact. So the chord progression I'm using is this. It's sort of the C minor 7, D minor 7, then D sharp major 7th and back. So this is C minor 7th, D minor 7th, D sharp major 7th, and then back. And then normally this chord progression would sort of resolve all the way down to A sharp major 7th and that G minor 7th, which I actually never use in the progression. So that's what I have. And let's sort of go back to that thing. So the very first thing I created for it was using the Micro Monster, is basically that bass chord progression. So then from that, I wanted to sort of talk about sort of that opening thing, which is really interesting. So that sound here is actually coming from the Yamaha MU80, which is a Rumpler, and it's literally that first chord that's being arpeggiated all the way up the keyboard, right? I really love that little blinky thing. The delay is coming from the onboard effects on the MU80, and it's using the, what is this? That's the Vibes sound. So that's the first thing. And then the other two things that I have in this intro are that sort of staccato thing, which is sort of two sounds layered onto each other. One is coming from the Prime FM2 over here. So it's an FM percussive sound, and what's sort of interesting is the Prime FM doesn't have an onboard effects section, but I can use the MIDI effects on the Pyramid to do that. So there's actually a MIDI delay as opposed to an audio delay. And one interesting side effect of using a MIDI delay is that I can put a swing after the delay. So if I look at the effect stack, so I have the very first one is the delay, so it's the two notes at the 1/16th, and then after that I have the swing, which is also on 16th note, and is a sort of 55%, and it's actually shifting the delayed echoes as well. So I thought that's sort of an interesting thing to note. And then there's also it's being doubled by the Dreadbox Nix, which is an analog monophonic synthesizer that's going through the time as a delay box. The time also has a MIDI synced tap demo, so it's easy to get precise sort of 8-note or quarter notes or dotted 8-note things out of it. So those are two sounds that are over here. Then sort of going back to my chord progression, the next element is obviously the bass line. So what's interesting about the bass line is, so going back to the piano over here. So our chord progression is this, right? But the bass line, instead of using the C as a root note, it's actually over here. So it's completely shifting the meaning of those chords. It also never changes, right? So it stays constantly on the same note, even though the chord might sort of go up a little bit. All right, so the next instrument is that little chord stab that we have, which is coming from the Motor NF1. So it's a fairly sort of standard stabby sound that's actually done by a sort of triangle wave, very low pass filter, a little bit of dotted delay, and actually it's an 8-note delay and a lot of reverb. Right? The whole sort of delay space of that track is on 8-note. And the reason this works is because the stabs themselves are coming in on bar 3 and 7th. And they're also coming. They're not on the 1, and so they're sort of coming in very late. Actually, we need a reference for those. There you go. 2, 3, da, 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 da. 4. So that's those two. And that's the reason why sort of the chords themselves I kept fairly sparse, so I can have room to put other things. So I think that covers most of the instruments in that section. So if we jump to another section. All right, so what we have over here is we've added this particular track here, which is pizzicato. That's also coming from the MU80, the Yamaha Rompler. And what's happening is also one of my favorite tricks on the Pyramid. So if I look at the effect stack on the Pyramid, so we're starting with a chord. And then there's an arpeggio on the chord which randomly picks one note out of that chord. And then sort of shifts it randomly over a span of 2 octaves. Then there's a delay. There's an eighth note delay repeated 8 times. And then there's a random velocity applied to the note after the delay. So if you just use one note, you get that effect. So you get variations in the intensity, you get variations in the octave, and if you do that with a chord, you get this. And if you leave air, then you can sort of let that sort of those tails die down. So that's something I tend to go back, sort of variation on that sort of particular effect stack in a lot of my track, because I feel it sort of gives you a way to have a lot of variations cheaply and keep things sort of interesting. Oh, and that's another variation. So that was interesting because I think it's coming from that sequence over here, which is probably the busiest. So let's turn a bunch of shit off. Okay, bass is out. Little pizzicato thing. So that's an interesting trick as well. So in this chord progression, I really have like 4 bars of a solid chord. But what I'm doing here is step mode. what I'm doing here is actually constantly inverting the chord itself. So if I'm starting from, what is it? So that's my C minor 7th, right? If we take this note over here and send it over there, oops, sorry, here, right? So these are all inversion of that same C minor 7th using different root notes every night. And that allows me to basically layer a subchord progression on top of the main compression. And then we can sort of, when we shift from sort of C to D, we can do that same trick, right? Oops. It helps if you don't fumble and play on notes. So start again. Ah, why am I doing this? Right, so basically those two, like sort of both over the C minor 7 and the D minor 7, I have that sort of rotating inversion, which I thought was a sort of neat little trick to use. And what else do we have? Let's go back to a sequence mode. All right, so let's talk about the sequencer a little bit. So in the pyramid, you have sequence mode, track mode, and patterns. So sequences, tracks, and patterns. And the way I arrange things, so this is the sequence page. I actually arrange my sequences, and the sequences are groups of active tracks and the current pattern in each of these tracks. So all the stuff that we talked about, each of them have different patterns. And the way I use it is I generally sort of split up my sequence page into functional group that I keep sort of clustered together as opposed to just filling in from 1 to X, right? So the sort of first row is going to be all of the sequences that are designed to work with my first chord progression, and the second row is the ones for the second chord progression, which is effectively the same thing. What do I have as a note? So in that second progression, we'll alternating between that C minor 7 and D minor 7 4 bars at a time, while the bass line stays stuck on that same. Actually, no, the bass line goes up as well. So what we have here is what do we have? And also it introduces the Blofeld playing a fairly sort of slow evolving pad, which is I think a layer of 2 different patches on the Blofeld. So there we go. And that's sort of each of these sequences then have patterns that are reflecting those chord progression in each of the instruments. So if I go back to, let's go back to that first sequence and play the bass. So if I go to the pattern page for that bass, actually no, let me pick the bass. Okay, so this is the pattern page for the bass. I have 6 patterns in the bass. So 3 of them are for that first chord progression. And then 3 of them are for the second chord progression. And again, sort of clustered visually, so I know my first row is going to be these patterns, my second row is going to be these other patterns. And generally I have usually sort of 3 or 4 variations on the pattern for each section. And there, you can have up to 32 patterns, I believe. for each instrument. Yeah. So 2 pages of 16 pattern. So that sort of gives you quite a bit of room to play with. And then the last thing I wanted to talk, so what do we have? We covered, I think we covered everything. So the last thing I wanted to talk about quickly is the drum stuff and the deluge. In this particular track, the deluge is not breaking a sweat because it's hardly doing anything. I think I have sort of 4 sounds. That's it. So kick, snare, a snap with a huge amount of reverb, and then a highlight. And the other thing I do on the sort of track page, so we were sort of mainly working off that second page here, which has all the instruments. The first page of tracks is where I put all the drums. So generally, sort of, I know page 1 is all the drums. Page 2 has bass lines and chords and things. And if I need to spill over, I can go on to page 3 and 4. There's 64 tracks in total in the pyramid, so more than enough to my needs. So we have the kick here. Then we have the snare. And I believe the snare, just like the bass line, is actually looping on 3 bars instead of 4, which basically makes that little syncopated thing happen on a different spot of the song every time. Then we have first hi-hat, another cymbal, claving, and then the shaker. So I think that covers everything. I was originally thinking that I would also cover a lot of sound design stuff, but I think this video is already running long. So maybe next time I'll talk more about the sound design and picking another track rather than this one, which was sort of fairly sort of complex in terms of the number of instruments and things. And that's it. Hope you had a good time. Merci, à la prochaine.